Welcome to episode 7 of Rise of a Nation, South America. This episode is on Bolivia.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack your sources to uncover the most important insights. Today we're diving deep into the rich and complex history of Bolivia, a topic you specifically requested. We've got a stack of articles and notes here taking us from ancient times right up to the present. We're looking at centuries of change, tracing its story through pre-colonial civilizations, the intense period of Spanish colonization, that long fight for independence,
Right.
the painful loss of access to the sea, and then the dramatic political and economic shifts, of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yeah.
It's a history profoundly shaped by geography, incredible natural wealth, and, tenacious resistance.
And what really stands out in the material you sent over is how deeply these historical events, particularly things tied to resource extraction and territorial conflicts, continue to resonate. They influence Bolivia's development and national identity even now. We're going to try and connect those threads for you.
Exactly. We're exploring a place where, according to this striking detail in one of your sources, the legendary Cerro Rico mountain in Potosi, it yielded so much silver during the colonial era, people claimed enough was extracted to build a bridge across the Atlantic.
An incredible image, isn't it?
It is. Yet this history of immense wealth sits alongside, present-day challenges and poverty. Okay, let's unpack this history from your sources. So, our journey begins way before the Europeans, with powerful ancient cultures like the Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca. Your sources describe them as pretty advanced.
Sophisticated societies, yeah. Built around controlling surplus food, llama herds.
Right, before the Inca Empire expanded and incorporated this region as the province of Quayasuyu.
But the really defining transformation, as your sources detail, began in the early 16th century. That's the Spanish conquest, following figures like Francisco Pizarro. This territory became known as Upper Peru. Initially, it was part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, but later, strategically, it was shifted to the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, with its capital down in Buenos Aires in 1776.
And what really fueled the Spanish interest, and let's be honest, the subsequent exploitation, was the sheer abundance of natural resources, especially silver, found in the highlands.
Absolutely. The city of Potosi and its famous mountain, the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, that became the absolute heart of the colonial economy there.
It's truly fascinating how fast Potosi grew because of this mining boom.
It is. By the mid-17th century, your sources indicate it was one of the largest cities in the entire Western Hemisphere, population around 160,000.
Wow.
But, and this is a critical insight from your material, this staggering wealth came at a horrific, absolutely devastating human cost, primarily borne by the indigenous populations.
Yeah, the sources are quite stark about that experience for indigenous peoples. They faced catastrophic population decline, European diseases, obviously, but also just intense exploitation.
And Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, he formalized the infamous MITA system in the 1570s.
The MITA, right? Essentially a forced labor draft.
Exactly. Requiring adult males from specific districts to work in those brutal mine conditions every 6th year.
It's just brutal.
This forced labor system, plus technological shifts like introducing the mercury amalgam process for refining, which, importantly, stripped local Indians of their traditional control over refining techniques, it dramatically boosted silver production.
But made conditions even worse.
Oh, absolutely. Even later in the 18th century, the Bourbon reforms, which were meant to revitalize mining with financial support and lower taxes, they couldn't actually prevent Potosi's economic decline by the early 1800s.
Though mining's influence on related things like food supply lines, that remained significant.
It did, yes.
And beyond the mines, the Spanish also established encomiendas. These were like grants, right? Giving conquistadors rights to indigenous labor and produce.
That's right. Though agricultural production later tended to consolidate onto large estates, the haciendas.
And another key colonial revenue source, especially as mining income dropped off, was the Indian tribute, the alcabala.
The alcabala, a kind of sales tax or tribute payment levied on the indigenous population. Your sources note it became particularly crucial in the late 18th century as that population began to recover slightly.
And one source highlights that this tribute was arbitrarily increased by $1 million Spanish annually, regardless of actual economic conditions.
Which tells you something about the priorities. Administratively, the Spanish crown also shifted strategy. They moved from relying on local indigenous nobles for control to using Spanish officials called corregidores de indios.
And these guys were notorious for abuse.
Extremely, often forcing indigenous communities to buy imported goods they didn't need, just lining their own pockets. It generated huge resentment across the region.
Your sources also shed light on the role of the Catholic Church, central to converting native populations, obviously, but also establishing colonial institutions.
Okay.
Bishoprics in La Plata early on, then La Paz, Santa Cruz.
And Upper Peru's first university in Chuquisaca in 1623.
But while the church was definitely a tool of colonial power, your sources also mention this development of a unique folk Catholicism, kind of blending indigenous symbols.
Yeah, and some tolerance for local practices, like allowing the sanctuary for the Virgin de Copacabana. It shows a more complex picture of cultural interaction, not just imposition.
And despite all these controls and even some adaptation or using Spanish courts, resistance was constant.
Absolutely constant. Your sources cite over 100 revolts just in Bolivia and Peru in the 18th century alone.
Like the big one led by Tupac Amaru II.
Exactly. Which really underscores just how precarious Spanish rule actually was in the Andes.
And this simmering discontent, it was really amplified by growing frustrations among the criollos, people of Spanish descent, but born in the America.
Right. They resented the trade barriers, Spain's mercantilist policies, and being shut out of the top administrative jobs. Those were reserved for Spanish-born peninsulares.
That division created a powerful dynamic, didn't it? Setting the stage for conflict.
It really did.
So this volatile situation finally reached a boiling point when Spanish royal authority just weakened dramatically during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula, 1807-1808.
And suddenly the empires plunged into confusion, conflicting loyalties among the local elites in Upper Peru. It just cracked open the door for change.
Your sources describe this period, 1808 to 1810, as the first phase of independence efforts, often more like local power struggles initially.
Yeah, you had revolts like the one Pedro Domingo Murillo led in La Paz in 1809. They proclaimed governing juntas.
But interestingly, often still in the name of the deposed Spanish king Ferdinand VII, shows the initial confusion.
It does, but these early uprisings were ultimately put down by forces sent from neighboring viceroyalties.
So the full-scale struggle for independence ended up being a long, brutal 16-year war, lots of guerrilla warfare in many areas from about 1815 onwards.
And this is where the big names of South American independence, Simón Bolívar and Antonio José de Sucre, become really central to Upper Peru's story.
Bolívar led an army, won that crucial Battle of Junin in August 1824.
And Sucre, carrying on the campaign for Bolívar, achieved the decisive victory at the Battle of Ayacucho in December 1824. That was a watershed moment.
The end of Spanish power on the mainland, essentially.
Pretty much. The Spanish viceroy's capitulation recognized Peru's independence and signaled the end.
So after that victory, Sucre gets the mission. Liberate Upper Peru, set up an independent government, basically formalizing what had been happening with local resistance for years.
Right. The Congress of Chuquisaca officially declares independence in 1825.
And the new republic is named in honor of Simón Bolívar, Bolivia.
A fitting tribute.
But then, the 19th century, after independence, well, according to your sources, it was largely defined by political instability.
Yeah, numerous coups, short-lived constitutions for nearly 40 years, especially after Marshal Andrés de Santa Cruz's presidency.
Santa Cruz had that period of success, though, even unifying Peru and Bolivia into the Peru-Bolivian Confederation.
He did. But, as one source points out, this move explicitly referencing the Inca Empire was seen as a major threat regionally, especially alarming to Chile, which also held former Inca lands.
Right, so that led to the War of the Confederation.
It did. And despite some initial successes for Santa Cruz, treaties like Pacarpata, which Chile's parliament then rejected.
The Confederation was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Yungay in 1839.
Marking a return to instability for Bolivia, a real turning point.
But maybe the single most impactful event of the 19th century for Bolivia, the one whose consequences are still so deeply felt, was the War of the Pacific, starting in 1879.
Yeah, this conflict pitted Bolivia and Peru against Chile, and your sources make it really clear it stemmed directly from disputes over control and taxation of valuable natural resources.
Nitrates and guano, mainly.
Exactly, in the Atacama Desert. And crucially, this was the region where Bolivia held territory and had its only access to the Pacific Ocean since independence.
The sources highlight key tensions. There was that secret treaty between Peru and Bolivia from 1873, which Chile saw as a threat.
and specific disagreements over contracts, duties, related to saltpeter extraction in disputed territory, land controlled by Bolivia but exploited by a Chilean company. Resource disputes were the flashpoint.
So after Chile secured naval control, they launched their land campaigns.
Focusing on key Peruvian provinces like Tarapacá, where the nitrate fields were, and then advancing towards strategic cities like Tacna and Arica.
The Battle of Tacna, May 1880. A big defeat for the Allies, Bolivia and Peru.
Quickly followed by the Battle of Arica in June. And your sources state that after this campaign, the regular armies of both Peru and Bolivia were effectively decimated. Bolivia largely withdrew from the fighting then, though it was formally still at war until '84.
And the war ended with dramatic territorial changes. The Treaty of Ancon, 1883, saw Peru cede Tarapacá to Chile.
And for Bolivia, the outcome was devastating. The loss of its entire coastline.
Completely landlocked.
Completely. The 1904 Treaty of Peace and Friendship formalized this. Bolivia officially ceded the territory Chile had occupied, including Antofagasta.
Your sources note that in exchange, Bolivia got some commercial concessions, free trade rights in Chilean ports.
And the construction of a railway connecting Arica and La Paz, paid for by Chile, specifically to help Bolivia's trade given its new landlocked status. But sovereign access was gone.
Moving into the 20th century, Bolivia saw these cycles of revolution, long periods of military rule, and then eventually a transition back to democracy.
Your sources mention the Bolivian National Revolution in the 50s as a major internal upheaval, and then the military coup in 1964 that overthrew President Paz Estenssoro,
Ushering in nearly 2 decades of military governments.
bringing us closer to the present. From the return to democracy in 1982 onwards, your sources cover key events like the Cochabamba Water War in 2000.
Right, that stemmed from issues around water privatization.
Exactly, and the gas conflict, which in 2006 led to the nationalization of oil and gas resources under President Evo Morales, it underscores that continued importance of resource control and public services in their politics.
Evo Morales' long time in office saw big changes. Your sources highlight a focus on poverty reduction, citing a 20% decrease over a decade.
But his tenure also included major political crises, notably in 2019, following those disputed election results.
This period is described quite differently in the material you shared.
It is. Some sources cite allegations of electoral fraud based on OAS reports and other analyses, which triggered massive protests.
While other sources argue those claims were fabricated or based on misused data, calling what followed a U.S.-backed coup.
What's clear across the sources, though, is that following these events, the armed forces publicly requested Morales' resignation, and he subsequently went into exile.
Janine Áñez then served as interim president, but she was later arrested. The current president, Luis Arce, took office in November 2020.
And a notable economic point mentioned in your sources about his administration. Bolivia achieved the lowest inflation rate in Latin America during 2021-2022. But throughout this whole modern period, one issue just remains consistently prominent and incredibly sensitive: that loss of sovereign sea access from the War of the Pacific.
It's really striking, isn't it? Despite being landlocked since 1879, Bolivia's connection to the sea remains this potent national symbol.
Absolutely. They maintain a navy, founded in 1963 on Lake Titicaca.
And annually commemorate the Day of the Sea to remember the lost coast. Evo Morales made regaining access a central policy goal, used it politically too.
And this persistent desire culminated in that case Bolivia brought against Chile before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, back in 2013.
Right, and Bolivia wasn't asking the court to give them sovereign access.
No, but rather to find that Chile had a legal obligation to negotiate with Bolivia towards granting that sovereign access.
Chile argued the whole matter was settled by the 1904 treaty, so the ICJ shouldn't even have jurisdiction.
But the court ruled in 2015 that it did have jurisdiction. It clarified the case wasn't about the 1904 treaty itself, but specifically whether a separate legal obligation to negotiate sovereign access existed independent of that treaty.
So Bolivia argued this obligation existed based on various past statements, diplomatic exchanges with Chile over the years.
And they also stressed the significant economic disadvantages of being landlocked, citing how it results in higher logistical costs, slower, more expensive trade compared to neighbors with ports.
Makes sense.
The final ruling from the ICJ came in October 2018, a 12-judge majority. They rejected Bolivia's main arguments.
Finding Chile had no legal obligation based on prior conduct to negotiate sovereign access.
Right. The court didn't rule on territorial control itself, but it did suggest both parties continue dialogue, in a spirit of good neighborliness to address Bolivia's landlocked situation. recognizing it as a matter of mutual interest.
After the ruling, Evo Morales vowed Bolivia would never give up its claim. Chilean President Piñera called it justice served.
And more recently, March 2021, President Luis also reiterated the dispute remains open and pending for Bolivia, offering a 9-point plan. Chile responded by referencing the ICJ ruling, but signaling openness to dialogue on broader bilateral issues. So it's ongoing, in a sense.
Wow, what a journey through Bolivia's history that is, laid out in the material you provided.
Yeah.
From the literal depths of its silver mines that fueled a distant empire,
Yeah.
through its dramatic fight for independence, the incredibly painful and impactful loss of its connection to the Pacific that still defines so much of its modern identity,
Absolutely.
and the ongoing political and economic story right up to today, where the country is still grappling with these echoes of its past.
It absolutely underscores how a nation's geography, its vast resources, often coveted the outcomes of historical conflicts like the War of the Pacific, even differing interpretations of past agreements, how all that can continue to profoundly shape present challenges, domestic politics, international relationships.
It shows incredible resilience alongside these persistent struggles. And there's such a clear thread connecting that early colonial exploitation and the grievances from territorial losses right through to current political discourse and foreign policy.
It really does. And this all raises, I think, an important question. Given this deep history, resource wealth intertwined with exploitation, the profound and lasting impact of losing sea access, the cycles of political instability the country's seen, and these ongoing calls for dialogue on historical issues. How might Bolivia best navigate balancing that need to honor its past struggles and historical claims with forging a sustainable path towards future prosperity and stability, both economically and diplomatically, within the complex regional and global landscape it inhabits?
That's a powerful thought to sit with. That's all for this deep dive. We hope exploring these sources together gave you a clearer picture and perhaps sparked some new questions for your own learning journey.
Thank you for watching Episode 7 of Rise of a Nation, South America. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's rise you would like me to cover next.